for every $100 of loans a bank makes, they don't hold much more than $5 or $6 of equity capital, the risk absorbing equity, to protect against a loan loss. And the reason I bring this up, so in other words, they're 20, if they're 5 times equity and on $100 of loans, they're 20 times levered, which means the other $95 comes from deposits or a subordinated debt. Okay, this is just the reality of banking. Lies the problem of the global banking system and why I love Bitcoin better than any other digital asset that would solve the fiat Ponzi.
Greg Foss, one of the co-founders of Looking Glass, an education platform that helps investors navigate their financial future with Bitcoin, is one of the top advocates for the world's largest cryptocurrency. Foss' unwavering conviction about Bitcoin comes from his decades of experience in the traditional finance industry, especially the banking sector. This is ironic, but as someone who has seen the rot from the inside, there is no one better experienced than Foss to warn others about the impending collapse of the global banking system. Despite increasing financial education, many people still put a lot of trust in the traditional banking industry. But that trust is completely misplaced because the whole industry is a house of cards that can go toppling at any point. In a recent interview, Foss explains in detail just how bad the situation is not just with the banking sector in the United States and Canada, but the global banking sector as a whole. Thankfully, there is a solution that saves us all from the overly leveraged banking sector and provides a chance to multiply your wealth enormously. This is, of course, no other than Bitcoin, the world's largest cryptocurrency and the best-performing asset of the past decade by over 1,000%. We will now take you to Greg Foss' interview. But before we do, please take a little time to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to drop all your comments and observations in the comment section below. Enjoy the video.
One of the big differences between the United States and Canada is the banking system. And everyone has this idea, oh, the Canadian banks are so safe, you know, oh, those US banks, they're not safe because they do crazy stuff. But Canadian banks are very safe. And this is one of the reasons I bring this up, because that's not true. Banking as a whole is a very, very risky business. The amount of leverage in banks is basically the same around the world, in that in order to compete in banking, you have to have a similar capital structure. And that capital structure is built on the fact that for every $100 of loans a bank makes, they don't hold much more than $5 or $6 of equity capital, the risk absorbing equity, to protect against a loan loss, which is another way of saying, imagine how many loans lose more than 5% of their value in the event of a bankruptcy. I'll tell you, it's a lot more than 5 cents on the dollar. The typical recovery rates are anywhere from 0 to 40 cents on the dollar recovery rate, which means you lose at least 60 cents. So the key is not to have too many loan losses, but the reality is banks are cyclical. So I happened to join in 1988. And it's a story I often tell. Came back to Canada and I worked for Royal Bank of Canada, Canada's largest financial institution still. And that was the same case in 1988. And I was working directly for the CFO. And the CFO, good French-Canadian guy, Emile. One of my first projects was to evaluate the Latin American debt portfolio of the Royal Bank of Canada. And in 1988, the world was suffering a debt crisis. It was driven by imagine that, an appreciating US dollar, much like we're experiencing today, that crushed emerging market economies. And these emerging market economies had all taken out loans denominated in US dollars. So their economies were tanking, their tax revenues were going down, and the interest expense was rising because it was in US dollars. So it was a recipe for disaster. And the average Latin American loan was trading at 25 cents on the dollar at the time. One of my first projects was to evaluate the portfolio for the CFO and determine what Brady plan option we were to take as a restructured debt option from US Treasury Secretary Nicholas Brady, who had designed these restructurings for the global banking system. It wasn't just Royal Bank of Canada. It was the entire global banking system that was in the same situation. And essentially, here's the story. I did a quick back of the envelope calculation, and under 10 minutes, I determined the Royal Bank of Canada was bankrupt. Here's Canada thinking we have a really strong banking system relative to the 10,000 banks they had in the US. We only have 6 nationwide banks. Well, we were all in the same problem. The entire banking system was insolvent, on its way to bankruptcy, and the CFO doesn't want anyone to know.
The fiat Ponzi scheme is probably the greatest Ponzi scheme of all time. Take the US dollar, for instance. In the past century, the purchasing power of the leading fiat currency has fallen by almost 100% due to rising inflation and the increasing money supply. This means Americans are paying more to get the same goods and more families are being sent below the poverty line. But not all Americans are suffering the consequences of the Ponzi scheme. The top 1% benefit from it quite nicely. They benefit from the fiat Ponzi every time they get a new bank bailout loan or corporate bond loan, which they invest in assets, essentially abandoning the ship they helped to sink. While the fiat world is built to wreck the poor and make the rich richer, the blockchain industry gives the masses a decent fighting chance. Let's get back to Greg Foss' interview as he speaks further about the collapse of the banking industry and how Bitcoin comes to the rescue.
And that was really the first time I started to question this whole fiat system. Because the reality is, Canadians, firstly, don't know that the banks are that exposed to risk, but what they always feel is that our bank would be backstopped, and this is largely true. The failure of the Royal Bank would be backstopped by the government of Canada, right? Too big to fail. And while that's true, how does the Bank of Canada backstop Royal Bank of Canada? By printing money, okay? That's the only way that they would be able to backstop a failure of the Canadian banking system. So therein lies the problem of the global banking system and why I love Bitcoin better than any other digital asset that would solve the fiat Ponzi, okay? So first thing for your listeners to understand, you have digital assets, yes. I like to refer to Bitcoin and then the other digital assets. Some people call them shitcoins, that's fine. I only know this, that Bitcoin is the only digital asset that solves the fiat Ponzi. And for that reason, it's the one I focus on because I believe the fiat Ponzi to be the biggest impediment to our children's future. The banks have been bailed out on a regular basis. I lived 1988. 10 years later, I lived long-term capital management, 1998, where you had a Nobel Prize winning economist who levered a hedge fund 100 to 1, not 20 to 1, 100 to 1, and sold insurance to Wall Street. And then Wall Street had to bail out the insurance company because they realized the insurance they were buying had no value. So they had to bail out the insurance company. That's 1998 long-term capital management. Then I was working at a hedge fund in the 2008 great financial crisis. Again, kicking the can down the road, socializing losses on Wall Street, driven by subprime mortgage lending. All of this is to say, people, the banking system and capitalism is the Ponzi. I love capitalism, but there is no such thing as capitalism in banks. They socialize the losses. Every time they blow their brains out, the Fed and central banks come in to rescue them. It's no way to run a capitalist system. You need creative destruction in capitalism. But what's happened with the banking system in the successive banking crises, continued bailouts. The TARP program in 2008 was just under $1 trillion. That's the Troubled Asset Relief Program. That's $1 trillion. 10 years later, the globe just printed $10 trillion to rescue the COVID crisis. Again, another banking crisis. So what is Bitcoin? It is scarce, 21 million supply. It is not controlled by anybody. So it is not central bank planning. It is not centralized. There's no CEO. If you're not happy with Bitcoin, you can't write a letter to anybody, okay? It's controlled by a network of computers around the world that defend the protocol and security of this network. So people say, Bitcoin's got no intrinsic value. Well, I think it's got a ton of intrinsic value as an insurance product. But if you don't buy that argument, understand it's got network value, much like the internet. Just get a Bitcoin wallet for yourself or for your children or for both of you and experience the beauty of being able to send monetary value anywhere in the world that will settle instantaneously as a lightning transaction or within 10 minutes as an on-chain Bitcoin transaction. If you guys don't understand how beautiful that is, to be able to send money anywhere in the world, go and try and send a wire transfer through the Canadian bank system and try and settle it in a place like New Zealand. I've done it. I can promise you that it is a painful process that you can get accomplished in 10 minutes on the Bitcoin blockchain.
We are at a pivotal moment in the history of the global economy. We are at a tipping point, and every step you take now will determine what your finances will look like in the future. Will you stick with a collapsing fiat world or switch to a new system that offers much more assurance and convenience without any sort of manipulation from the rich and powerful? What are your thoughts on Greg Foss' interview? Please drop your comments and observations below, hit the like button, and subscribe. Thanks for watching our videos.